This isn't your everyday Article 13 video, which unfortunately I know because I wrote that script and had to throw it out because of new changes that the EU has made to their final proposal. They reworded Article 13 to take out every enforceable part of the bill, and all they left is a giant pile of legal mush. But before we get into all the changes and what it means, let's start with the basics. Article 13 is part of a European copyright reform that says that copyrighted content has to be banned upon upload by content hosting websites. And in the original document, this meant that all copyrighted content, even copyright exceptions like parody, fair dealing, and educational videos would be affected. Needless to say, the internet was pretty angry and worried about this new law.
The current proposal of Article 13 will create large unintended consequences.
Article 13, when the content is uploaded, unless they know for sure who owns every single part of it, it wouldn't make sense for YouTube to allow for it to go up.
Most content creators you know who are based in the EU will be banned from YouTube.
We're all gonna be banned, was the general consensus, because it's true, the first drafts of this law were horrible. But no one has spent much time talking about the massive changes that this law went through and what it means. See, when I started my original script, this was a much different Article 13. It was 900 words, 8 sections, and it talked far more specifically about repercussions, who would be affected, and how it would be implemented. But after months of discussion, the EU has settled on a new version that takes out every specific guideline and leaves us with vague words like best practices, cooperation with rights holders, large amounts, appropriate, and proportionate. You still get the feeling reading it that it will have big implications for copyright, but there's nothing to build rules around because nothing is clearly defined for people like YouTube or Facebook that will be affected by this bill. This thing turned from a law about copyright enforcement to be more like an announcement about a law about copyright enforcement that someday in the future will be further defined. Which, as it turns out, is kind of an EU strategy. Making laws vague has its advantages. But this is a huge problem for companies outside of the EU and leaves us with a question. What should we do with vague laws?
What are the rules? What are the rules? What are the rules? What are the rules? When you've kept your brain, but the world's insane, how the hell you gonna find out the rules?
Let's start by talking about the US, which actually has laws about vague laws. In the US, there's something called the vagueness doctrine. It says that criminal laws, and sometimes civil laws, that aren't clear as to be understandable by a man of common intelligence are void. Or to put it another way, you can't be punished for breaking a law you're not sure how to keep. In the US, there was a case of the FCC versus Fox, which illustrates how this works using America's two favorite things: bad words and nudity. The FCC has these rules on broadcasting that are called obscenity laws, that say what you can and cannot show on TV, what is appropriate and what is not. The problem is that obscenity is an incredibly difficult thing to define, because as we discussed in a previous video, what's obscene is always changing. And rather than take a stab at it anyways and make specific rules, the FCC decided to be ambiguous. They described what is inappropriate using words like patently offensive by contemporary community standards. And this all came to a head when, during an award show, a couple people dropped F-bombs and later Fox aired partial nudity.
That's really, really fucking brilliant.
So fuck 'em.
After these programs were aired, the FCC sent out a new ruling further defining their vague obscenity laws, and then tried to hold Fox accountable for breaking those new descriptions of what obscenities look like. The case of whether the FCC could fine Fox for breaking their newly defined obscenity laws went all the way up to the Supreme Court, who eventually decided that because Fox didn't know ahead of time what constituted obscenity and indecentness, the law was too vague to prosecute them. That is how the US handles vagueness. Now, back to the EU. They don't have an explicit vagueness doctrine, and this has caused a lot of problems for American tech companies. In a similar way to how Fox almost got in trouble for breaking rules that weren't clearly defined, Google did get in trouble in Europe for the same reason. They were recently fined for breaking antitrust laws that ruled that they were being anti-competitive by pre-installing certain apps on their Android devices. The problem? Google says they didn't know this was anti-competitive. In their statement back to the EU, they argue that the EU's reason to impose a fine rested on a novel legal theory. In conclusion, they say, there is no precedent for characterizing Google's conduct as an illegal abuse. The rules must be knowable in advance. But there aren't any vagueness laws in Europe, which means that that line of reasoning didn't stop the EU from leveling a $5 billion fine against Google, all for violating a rule that Google says they didn't know at the time they were breaking. This is the problem with vague laws. Either you can't enforce them or the enforcement seems arbitrary and unfair. And look, there are compelling reasons to make vague laws. Judges get more latitude to interpret with the changing times, and the EU can give the member states the ability to interpret those vague laws. But many people say that that doesn't outweigh the huge cons that come with ambiguous legislation, the number one problem being nobody knows how to follow your rules. An example of this can be seen in another EU law. The General Data Protection Regulation has also been accused of being too vague. They define personal data in such a way that it could mean basically anything, which has left tech companies scrambling to try to get into compliance with a law they aren't sure they understand. And this is the EU playbook. They declare really broad guidelines, but won't specifically define the rules of the road. Instead, it's just left to these companies to self-define, and the price of being wrong is devastating to companies, which is why everyone seems to be on edge with what the EU will do next as they flex their regulatory muscles. And this brings us back to Article 13. Nobody is quite sure what the EU means when they say measures to ensure the functioning of agreements with rights holders, or means when they say use of effective content recognition technologies shall be appropriate and proportionate. But what is clear is that Article 13 means a lot more than it says. Because if the first proposals of Article 13 were any indication of the EU's long-term plan, copyright exceptions, memes, and fair dealing will not be protected or worse, allowed at all in the EU, which threatens content creators like me and many, many, many others. If we look at the EU's history of vague lawmaking, it's clear that Google, Facebook, Reddit, all these tech companies, and all these YouTubers have every reason to be very scared over these new laws and protest them defiantly. I think we all should, not because Article 13 says all that much, but because of what the EU can later say it meant all along. Is this thing on? This is a new mic, so you'll have to bear with me as we figure out how to use it together. Our sponsor today is NordVPN, which is a very timely sponsor. If you're going to be affected by Article 13 or any of these other wacky internet regulations that a lot of these countries are pursuing, you need to be protected, and you'll be protected by a VPN. I've used VPNs when I did a study abroad in college. I went to Qatar, or Qatar, however you prefer to say it, and I had to use VPNs all the time because the internet there is very regulated. Even a simple thing like watching a football game, you want to go to a local server, just hop on your VPN and you get there. But VPNs go a lot further than just, looking like you're from somewhere else. Really, they're about data privacy, and this is a big problem in our modern world. People are getting better and better at stealing your information, especially if you like to go to coffee shops or hotels, or you're in airports a lot. This is a huge problem. Your data is unprotected, and the things you're sending over the internet can be looked at, can be stolen. So that's something you want to protect yourself from. And one way to do that is a VPN. The way I think about VPNs is they're kind of like a seatbelt for the data world. You don't need them very often, but when you do, you're really glad you have them because they keep you from a disaster. And one of the really big sells of Nord for me is the simplicity of use, because I've used VPNs in the past and they're very complicated and they're hard to set up. Nord is probably the simplest that I've tried, at least. And I'm going to show you just how easy that is, like on something like your phone, which I use all the time. So let's say you're, just browsing the internet as you do, and you realize suddenly you're on public Wi-Fi and your data is out there for anybody. What you're going to want to do, you go to NordVPN. All you do, press Quick Connect, and boom. It is that easy. For me, the simplicity is pretty much everything, because like I said, it's something like a seatbelt. You want it there, but you don't want it in your way. So if you're thinking about getting a VPN and you're a fan of the show, you can go to nordvpn.com/coffeebreak to get 75% off 3 years and an extra month free. That's nordvpn.com/coffeebreak.